Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Melanie Bisson, and I'm with Baylor University's School of Education, Department of Curriculum and Instruction's doctoral program. And today is my defense video on a qualitative collective case study examining the decision-making factors and theory behind the steady growth of homeschooling in America. So today I'm going to walk you through the literature review, the purpose of the study, the methodology, including research questions and data collection and analysis procedures, the findings and implications. So educators today seeking to understand why families are leaving public schools for homeschooling face a limited number of evidence-based resources, and they face a wealth of outdated research on the topic. Now, the National Center for Education Statistics, the NCES, states that the number of school-age children in parent-led home-based education steadily grew 36% from 2002 to 2012. The latest 2020 census is not quite out for analysis, but it did find that early data on the COVID-19 pandemic indicates that approximately 11% of US families are now homeschooling. And we also know that upwards of 7% in addition would homeschool if they could. And yet scholars have largely neglected this growing interest in homeschooling, and this lack of understanding surrounding the complexity and interconnected factors in a family's decision to homeschool really leaves society and academic personnel without the necessary information to collaborate with and learn from this population. Now, the details and progression of the homeschool movement in America are relevant because parents today enter this decision-making process more informed than ever, thanks to the internet and social media. So this literature review begins by defining the homeschooling movement throughout America's history and discusses its growth and popularity, from Van Galen's classification of homeschoolers as either ideologues or pedagogues to the 1960s reform of schools with John Holt's unschooling. I then discuss the variety of educational value systems and parental worldviews and beliefs about education that play this subconscious yet subtle role in the decision to homeschool, things such as values surrounding freedom, democracy in education, philosophies on state-sponsored education versus parental choice. And then it concludes with the specific decision factors that are most commonly cited among researchers, things like religion and curriculum. So more robust knowledge of the motivations to homeschool will ultimately ensure that parent-led home-based learning has a well-represented place in America's education system. This is something I'm passionate about. And so the purpose statement of the study is to understand the processes a family with young children goes through when deciding to homeschool. Young children is under the age of 5, so they haven't been influenced yet. And this case study examines families in that real-time decision-making process in order to promote an understanding of their lived experiences. So for the methodology, there were 3 decision-making theories that made up the conceptual framework for this study. Dual system theory, which says that individuals have 2 different sets of decision-making processes. You're either fast and impulsive or slow and methodical. Cognitive reflection theory, which is a relationship between time and risk and what your tendencies are. And rational choice theory, which is a model for predicting social behavior. Now, these theories were used as a lens to help make sense of how the decision-making factors interconnect. All these things like religious beliefs, employment, health and safety factors. And then the central research question was, how do parents' lived experiences explain the decisions of families with young children to homeschool? And by focusing on the decision-making process before a child enters an education format, for the first time, helped ensure that the data was collected and in a way that prevented the influence of additional factors on the theory. It was in real time. And so sub-questions include, what are the barriers for families who desire to homeschool but can't make the decision? What type of factors influence their decision and how do they interconnect? What sort of theories align with the behavioral processes and motivations described by these families? And did COVID-19 have an impact? Now, the criteria, again, was children under the age of 5 that were yet enrolled in any type of schooling. The parents needed to be rather undecided on the educational path, but certainly leaning towards homeschooling, and conducted a relatively limited amount of research. There were 13 participants, 13 families from 11 different areas in the country, from every region of the country. Their ages ranged from 26 to 36, mostly the mothers that participated, although we had quite a few husbands. An education span from high school to doctorate. Now, for the sampling procedures, I solicited participants in a variety of social media communities. They then went through the qualifying criteria in a Google form, and I narrowed those down based on a variety of research fidelity measures. And they had an hour to an hour and a half interview, then went through a series of self-reflections and journal entries over the period of a few months, and then concluded with the second interview. So for the data analysis, each case was first treated as a single case, organized into a descriptive narrative summary. Then a cross-case comparison was completed to identify patterns and trends among participants and their decision factors. And then after saturating these main categories through that first open coding process, there's about 54 subcategories that were created to identify the central phenomenon with the decision to homeschool. And after that, I developed conditional matrices to identify the degree to which these decision factors, mostly informed from the sub-questions, impacted parents' decision-making process. And so it was this really neat investigative approach that created a lengthy conditional relationship guide that allowed me to establish these patterns that contextualize this central phenomenon, and ultimately led to this construction of a theory that you'll hear about shortly. And then in between that thematic analysis and the theory development was the framework analysis on these decision-making theories using Yin's explanation building process. And that sought to understand why a phenomenon is happening. And I wanted to achieve the precision in answering the research question and developing a theory to make sure that there weren't any external factors that could have already been captured. Now, I expected to find themes consistent with the census survey's top reasons for homeschooling. So they've remained relatively unchanged over 20 years. And the top reasons were quality of instruction, quality of the learning environment, and religion and faith-based values. And what I found were that my participants in this study did not validate these findings. Actually, only 2 of the 13 had these concerns in their top 3 decision factors, and only 5 mentioned them as having any direct impact. So they were certainly prevalent in the study, but they weren't the sole contributor to the decision to homeschool. Things like religion, curriculum, health and safety, and financial factors played major roles and often influenced other factors in contingency scenarios with things like situational factors, relocation, family planning. Now, I found no decision factors to be reliable predictors of others, and the timing of when participants examined certain factors was relevant, things like socialization and learning styles, years before. These were subconscious factors that were likely not discussed in any type of quantitative survey. And the other finding of importance is that, unfortunately, applying this 3-part conceptual framework to the findings did not really result in any in-depth understanding of how the decision factors contributed to the overall decision. With dual system theory, I found that participants had a driving force in their interest to homeschool, whether they decided fast or slow, but it was separate from the factors that actually led them to homeschool. And with cognitive reflection tests, it was successfully achieved its purpose of indicating somebody's natural preference for time and risk. And it certainly confirmed their self-described approach to decision-making, but there was too much variety that existed to be able to draw any conclusions about the value add. And then I was unable to use rational choice theory as a rubric in making logical links between participants. And just like the other, it really just fell short in providing predictable social outcomes just based on the decision factors alone. Now, for motivational and behavior theories, there were about 5. The first is that rarely was homeschooling a permanent decision. There was sort of some constant change in situational factors that just impacted their overall lived experiences, and it's not forever. The second is that their really personal ties and relationships had a big influence in homeschooling. Third, religion and faith-based values, they were a primary factor, but they didn't carry this ideological stance that Van Galen, talked about in the literature review. And despite these stated factors, there was still the set of unique, subtle factors that sort of acted as a prerequisite before we got to these explicit factors that parents listed. And then the last theory is this number of factors, they're varying importance, and one's individual experiences really make the decision challenging to predict. Now, the most exciting discovery from my study is certainly the development of a theoretical framework to explain the decision to homeschool process. Now, in answering questions, who, what, where, when, why for each category during data analysis, I was able to identify occurring consequences that contextualized the central phenomenon or theme. And by examining these consequences in detail and really rearranging them within this reflective coding matrix, I was able to uncover their hierarchy and really add to this richness of these parent stories. So this family academic selection theory, or FAST, can be summarized as the decision continuum that parents go through in the commitment to their child's education. It answers a central research question of how do their lived experiences explain the decision to homeschool. There are 5 steps in the theory: reflecting, visioning, discovering, feeling, and decision-making that capture the dozens of dimensions and factors that are present throughout the process in real time. And these 5 steps provide context and modes for understanding the lived experiences of these families. Now, despite the theory's acronym, FAST, excuse me, it didn't really capture the fact that they did make fleeting decisions or rapid conclusions in their decision to homeschool. They did not, excuse me. Instead, they were very deeply committed to the process. You know, their thoughts, their discussions, their actions were very in-depth and personal. And so this list of dimensions in this figure here highlights the variety and volume of aspects that families considered. Now, regardless of whether or not they ultimately chose to homeschool, this FAST is utilized in the same manner to explain how their lived experiences influence their decision. So I applied the framework to all 13 participants, and it's similar across whether or not they decided to homeschool or not. Now, at the onset of the study, I did believe that the negative stigma towards homeschooling could be lessened if we understood the complexities in a parent's decision-making process. And I think the findings you saw and so many more that we didn't get to will challenge stereotypes and misconceptions about homeschooling. Now, several implications to ensure that homeschooling has a well-represented place in America include things like keeping close relationship with local schools, since homeschooling is not permanent, as well as many future research studies. But what I really want to focus on is sort of front and center in today's news around stakeholder education. And there's statements that federal and state officials are qualified to make decisions about a child's education, more so than their parents. And these statements fail to recognize that there's challenging circumstances parents face in the decision to educate their kids. Those who advocate for more state authority over child's education must reconcile that traditional school systems have an inability, and many times, to accommodate the needs of all children. And findings in the study revealed that there were various instances where schools were not adequately suited to care for the child during the school day. And a lack of attention to individual student needs has the potential to dramatically cut enrollment, as evidenced by many participants in the study who never considered homeschooling until circumstances dictated otherwise. So understanding the decision factors these participants wrestled with is necessary for school officials if they seek to meet the needs of their parents well above any financial or government stakeholders. Homeschooling will continue to grow without addressing health needs and teacher dynamics. And it would be wise of administrators to not have invested all of this time and energy into an infrastructure that can't outlast these poor conditions. So I believe the study will aid policymakers in updating truancy laws at the state and federal levels to accommodate homeschool families. I think it's time that homeschool populations return to coexisting among private and public schools in statewide considerations for districting and resources. Now, beginning with parents as a target audience for the study is, I think, going to help destigmatize homeschooling. I believe the study's findings are going to open up so much understanding about families' unique situations regarding educating their children, and it's just going to increase communication across all these different professional groups. So I really want to thank Baylor, our School of Education, our directors, especially my faculty advisor, Dr. Brooke Blevins, my defense committee, and the Writing Center. Just thank you so much, and I appreciate you listening.